fought uselessly on foreign soil. How the Americans screwed up the war with Vietnam. Welcome, everybody. Today, we're going to talk about the war events of 60 years ago. You will learn how American soldiers did with the prisoners of Vietnam. Is it true that almost 7 useless million tons of bombs were dropped on the territory of Southeast Asia? Is it true that at the end of the war, many American soldiers were addicted to the use of illegal substances? Be sure to watch the video to the very end to learn about everything in order, the beginning of the military campaign. As many of you know, the Vietnam War officially began in 1955. However, the key events in the Southeast Asian state began back in 1857. It was then that the French government accused Vietnam that there is no democracy there as such. Therefore, it subordinated the territory to its influence. So, Vietnam became a colony of French rule. Of course, over the years, the Vietnamese government did not forgive such an act of Europe, and already in 1941, the movement for independence began. The not-so-famous politician Ho Chi Minh opposed many countries that had even the slightest claims to the Vietnamese people. Finally, on September 2, 1945, a communist state was formed. But even this event did not solve all the issues. As you know, the country is divided into two main parts, North Vietnam and South Vietnam. The former was supported by several communist states, including the Soviet Union and China. South Vietnam, on the other hand, was supported by capitalists, especially America. Soon, these contradictions led to the fact that in 1961 of the last century, the United States brought its troops into the territory of North Vietnam. Thus began a full-scale military campaign. Participation of the Vietnamese female population in the war against the United States. Let's analyze the question regarding the women who participated in the war with the Americans. In fact, the following comes out. During the reign of Ho Chi Minh, equality between men and women defending the honor and freedom of their country was proclaimed. That is why Vietnamese girls and women went to war. For reference, about 1.5 million female representatives of the female sex served in the ranks of the North Vietnamese Army. It is important to note that women played a huge role in opposing the American military. They participated in sabotage, laid safe routes, served as guides, set traps and ambushes, treated wounded soldiers. Also, girls and women successfully disguised themselves and thus acted as reliable spies. But it is worth noting that what they feared most of all was being captured by the Americans. Especially after one case which went down in history under the name Incident on Hill 192. The captives were treated in a cruel and inhumane manner. So, it all started after 5 American soldiers decided to kidnap a Vietnamese girl from a nearby settlement without authorization. Secretly from the others, they got close to the territory, tracked down the victim, and took her to a shelter. The last one was Pan Thi Mao. After the insatiable Americans realized they were in no danger, they seized the moment. Although one of them refused to take part in the rape, but at the same time, he did not provide any help to the defenseless girl. So Pan Thi Mao was raped and then killed. You may ask, did the rapists go unpunished? Well, justice was served and they were indeed punished when they found out what had happened. And the measures were of the highest degree of punishment. The situation regarding the other captives was not the most appropriate. After all, at that time, propaganda of violence and sexual exploitation was actively spread among the American military. And not only adult women suffered, but also very young girls. The age of the captives was 15 years and more. Rebellion for independence and support from neighboring countries. Have you ever heard of the Viet Cong? That's how the participants of the South Vietnamese independence movement began to be called in the early 1960s. And the resistance began about a year before the US Army moved its troops to the territory of Southeast Asia. In the future, Vietnam against the fight against the United States was helped by neighboring countries. These included China, Laos, and Cambodia. Helped out especially with tanks and other weapons. Especially valued for its combat qualities and technical characteristics was the S-75 missile, designed to defeat airplanes and other aerial vehicles. Surprisingly, but until 1954, Vietnam withstood the attacks of aggressors and won the victory without military equipment. But in the case of the Americans, had to struggle, because the US on the territory of Vietnam concentrated up to 80% of military operations. The hardships and the fall of the Army's fighting ability. Oh, you can't even imagine how many bombs were used in all the years of the Vietnam War. Just for a minute, 6,727,000 tons. The Americans dropped in hopes that they would deliver a crushing blow to the Vietnamese. This warfare practice evolved into a doctrine, which has an appropriate name: find and destroy. Many war movies demonstrate this with the utmost precision and verisimilitude. American airplanes or helicopters fly over the jungle and drop a surprise. This is followed by a series of explosions and a bunch of fire. Hence the quote from the movie Apocalypse Now. I love the smell of napalm in the morning. But no matter how hard the US military tried, such ways of fighting did not bring the proper result. It is no secret that the Vietnamese know their territory very well and therefore can easily wait in a safe shelter. There are also numerous underground tunnels almost all over the Vietnamese territory. The Vietnamese guerrillas often hid in the jungle or went into the mountains. They showed fortitude and courage because such people fought to the last to defend the honor of their country. The guerrillas actively carried out terrorist attacks, the number of which exceeded 1,000. That is why the American Army experienced not only a number of severe trials, but also at the end of the war came into disrepair. It simply lost its fighting ability. This was realized by the top military leadership, which called the war with Vietnam useless, and the introduction of troops was a major mistake. The outcome of the war and losses on both sides. In 1973, there was a complete withdrawal of American troops from the territory of Vietnam. Almost everyone realized that it was useless to fight with an army experienced in terms of knowledge of the terrain. After 2 years, the Republic of Vietnam finally won the victory. The number of casualties on the part of both the United States and Vietnam is staggering. It is known that during the years of war, the Americans lost up to 60,000 soldiers and 300,000 entered the list of wounded and concussed. Also, approximately 1.3 thousand soldiers are listed as prisoners of war or missing in action. Interesting fact, Americans suffered not only from the Vietnamese fighting and various kinds of diseases, but also from the use of illegal substances. For example, in the second half of the 1970s, 1 in 5 soldiers took this ailment for pleasure. And here, the losses on the Vietnamese side are many times higher than the United States. According to statistics, South Vietnam lost 200,000 soldiers, while the number of soldiers along with the insurgents of North Vietnam is 1 million people. It should not be forgotten that not only the troops suffered, but also the inhabitants of Southeast Asia. Their losses are estimated at 700,000 people. Finally, 6.5 million Vietnamese are recognized as refugees. Conclusion. Thus, the war in Vietnam fully demonstrated the futility of action on the part of the United States. The Vietnamese had thoroughly prepared themselves for the onslaught of the capitalist state, which should have refrained from bringing in its troops. Soon, it will be exactly 50 years since the war between the United States and the Republic of Vietnam ended.